What's the point of a twist? Is it a pointless surprise in a story? A clever and thrilling change of pace? A way to shake up the expectations of your audience? Or maybe just a way to flip a story on its head and take it in another direction? Here's a twist for you. I turned 30 this September. Fuck. I'm not the only one coming up to a big birthday this year, though. In November 2001, Halo Combat Evolved was released, which means that this year the franchise is turning 20 years old. So it seems like the perfect time to talk about one of my favourite game franchises of all time. I first played Halo in the bedroom with one of my best friends from primary school. His dad had bought him this weird new console Microsoft had made, and the controllers were kind of gigantic and weird. But he did have this cool game called Halo. We spent an entire afternoon playing Blood Gulch, and I remember absolutely crying with laughter, driving around, shooting each other. After that, I decided I was going to save up for an Xbox, and I definitely wanted Halo to come with it. My love for the franchise grew and grew over the years, and 14 years ago on my 16th birthday, my parents got me a pre-order for Halo 3. The following week, when it was released in the UK, I had the whole day planned out. I sat through classes at school, grinding my teeth, counting every second. I would then take the 30-minute bus ride into town, power walk to the game shop, get my pre-order, get back on the bus, get finally home, sit down on the floor, and play the final installment of the trilogy. Hopefully that story gives you an insight into how much I absolutely love the Halo franchise. I could probably talk for a long time about what makes Halo such a special game. The environments, the artwork, the cinematics, the characters, the voice acting, the fresh gameplay, the multiplayer, the music. Oh dear God, the music. So good. But Halo is a popular game, and people have already talked about it in great length, so to try and keep this essay short, I'm not going to go on about that too much. Just let me direct you to a video series that I think absolutely nails it. Nakey Jakey's three-parter on the Halo franchise is absolutely a pleasure to watch. He's funny, he's handsome, he's clever. Yeah, just go watch it. You won't regret it. God bless. From the cold open of Halo, it's clear you don't have all the facts. You hear almost half a conversation between two characters, neither of which are you, the player, but you get enough information for it to make sense. You're being chased by an enemy, someone who is technologically superior to you, and who outnumbers you. Your options are currently limited, and the only solution you have is stand and fight. Thankfully, you're not alone. There's a whole ship of Marines ready to repel borders and fight shoulder to shoulder. You haven't even seen who you play as yet, but already you know so much about the world around you and what's about to happen. What I love about the humans in this franchise is that the technology is only mildly futuristic. It's not entirely outside the realms of disbelief. Sure, we colonize other worlds, build spaceships, and they run on fusion power, but they still use projectile-based weapons. They still use armor plating and not shields. They have arrays of missiles, Mach guns, they use smaller fighter craft. The humans in this story feel real, and it makes them a lot more accessible. The Covenant, on the other hand, come across as an unstoppable force. They have superior plasma-based weapons and explosives. Their ships use similar weapons. They're faster, technologically superior, and they seem to absolutely hate humanity and all it stands for. The human-Covenant conflict pits the humans against the superior force. We can put up a fight, but ultimately we aren't really a match for them. In the face of the Covenant, humanity stands like a mouse in front of a lion, nothing to wield against their aggressors but determination, courage, and an indomitable will to survive. But, despite all of that, the humans have one secret weapon. And that's you. It might come across as an overgeneralization, maybe even a little crass, but the Master Chief is just a killing machine. Genetically and cybernetically enhanced, John is strong and swift. He utilizes any weapon, any vehicle, any tool. He's able to handle any situation, so long as that situation involves shooting, driving, or something exploding. Going on a little tangent, when the first teaser trailer for Skyrim dropped, it had this particular line of dialogue in it.
But there's one they fear. In their tongue, he's Dovahkiin, Dragonborn.
Which is a really great line, and it always gives me chills. But they try to convey the Dragonborn as this monumental deal, and in reality, in the gameplay, that point always kind of falls flat with me. Dragons just attack you at random, so do normal enemies, and regular NPCs will fight the dragons, and sometimes they might even win. You want exactly a force of nature to be reckoned with, you're just sort of in the universe existing. Halo, by contrast, makes you feel the way I think they intended. When you fight elites, they scream and psych themselves up like warriors preparing for glorious battle. Grunts run and cower if they have no leaders. Jackals run and try to take you by surprise. Hunters... Well, actually, hunters never really say anything, and they're giant blue spiky armor-plated aliens with cannons fused to their arms, so really I don't think they come across as intimidated by you.
But that makes it all better to fucking kill them.
Halo puts you at the center of this conflict as one who might tip the scales, one who might actually shift the balance and change this unfortunate situation into an actual winnable fight. The first act of Halo sees you fight off the Covenant in small skirmishes and surgical strikes to gain a foothold against them. The rescue of Captain Keyes leads to a discovery of Halo as being a weapon, which then becomes a race to beat the Covenant to gain control of that weapon. The main objective in Act 1 is definitely survival. Either get the crew off the ring and away from the Covenant, or get the firepower to get the Covenant off the ring and back into dark space. This is portrayed beautifully through the opening levels of Halo, where the Pillar of Autumn is overrun and you have to abandon ship, then subsequently rescue survivors stranded after abandoning ship, then going on an infiltration mission aboard the Truth and Reconciliation to rescue the command crew. Follow that up with the Silent Cartographer, where you storm a beach in order to find a map to Halo's control center in my absolute favourite start to a mission ever. And then finally wrap it all up with a race to the control room as you join pockets of Marines to overcome Covenant forces and beat them to the punch. Each pocket of conflict you come across, I always feel like your presence there is so vital to shifting that tide of battle. Marines cheer when they see you arriving, they'll rally to you and look at you with awe, and even though they usually end up the same way, you feel like you're really making a difference in this fight. So why am I telling you all this? Well, the first 5 missions of Halo set up the Covenant to be the primary antagonist in the whole story, and that's about to get flipped on its head. In Act 2, the narrative shifts. We're introduced to a new antagonist that flips the story around from what was set up in the first act. Introducing a new antagonist in a narrative is risky business. That doesn't necessarily mean there aren't ways you can approach it that make it work. You need to make sure that what you've established so far doesn't just get thrown aside. There's no point in throwing away plot development you've already given the audience. But how do you keep things in balance? To take an example from Alien, something that Halo does quite a lot, your antagonists don't necessarily have to be united against the protagonist. They can actually work against the protagonist independent of each other. To explain what I mean, while the alien xenomorph is running rampant on the Nostromo, Ash, the ship's android, has secret orders to capture it and bring it back to the company. But he isn't working with the alien, he just provides another threat to our protagonist when his true nature is revealed. And when that does happen, he tries to kill Ripley by putting a magazine in her mouth. What is this achieving? The important thing to remember is that he isn't usurping the position of the primary antagonist. He's becoming a secondary antagonist, one who is motivated by established events in the narrative. We believe his betrayal because it makes sense for his character to do that. When they do the same thing in the sequel with Burke, it kind of makes sense, but it's a little more confusing because he's not an android, he has free will, and surely he's aware of the fact that the alien will just murder him to death when he tries to take it back to the company. That aside, the reasoning remains the same. The Wayland Company become a secondary antagonist in the Alien series, but they never usurp the position of the main threat. How many stories can you name where a secondary antagonist is introduced halfway through the story? Presumably you've thought of a few, because it happens all the time, but how many of those are actually good stories? What if a secondary antagonist is introduced and then they take over the role of the original antagonist? To use a famous example from recent years, in Game of Thrones we spend 7 seasons growing in anticipation, knowing that the petty squabbles of Westeros will ultimately be pointless when the Long Night comes and the dead march upon the Seven Kingdoms. But then that gets subverted when the Night King is vanquished fairly early on in Season 8, and the real villain is substituted to be the bad dragon lady we've been rooting for 8 seasons. Having a plot twist villain isn't necessarily bad though. In Mass Effect you spend a lot of your time chasing down a rogue Turian Spectre named Saren, and it's only towards the end of the final few missions you find out that Saren is actually being puppeted by an ancient AI killing machine with a proper knock-on for culling sentient life every few thousand years in the galaxy. Although this is a twist, Mass Effect doesn't actually change the enemy in your game. You still hunt down Saren, you still fight the Geth, the Krogan, the Husks. Now the stakes are just considerably higher. The primary antagonist wasn't usurped, they were just expanded on. So why would you do this in a video game if it's risky? Well, the easy answer is just to diversify the gameplay. Take Halo, for example. You spent the first 5 missions fighting the same enemies. Elites, grunts, jackals, maybe a hunter or two, maybe you're in a vehicle, maybe they're in a vehicle. Unless the game tries to shake things up by making certain guns unavailable or ammo very scarce, there's not really anything keeping you from fighting them the same way you've already established. Introducing a new enemy type, though, can keep things fresh. A new enemy should provide a challenge to the player. It should make you switch up your tactics. What a lot of games try to do, and in fairness Halo is also guilty of this, is that they'll reintroduce the same enemy but with a paint job and some more hit points. They would do this back in the early days to save on budget animations and keep asset costs down, but ultimately hardware's pretty good now. There's no reason why any modern game designer would try to do it this way, it's just cheap. There is another game I can think of that introduces a villain like halfway through the story with zero context, but it actually works. It's Halo. I'm obviously going to be talking about Halo. The introduction of the Flood is a surprise to the player. Everything in the game so far has just been humanity versus the Covenant, racing to control Halo. But, as Assault on the Control Room ends and 343 Guilty Spark begins, you were warned that the Covenant have found something, and that they're afraid. You race to the swamps of Halo to find what you believe is a weapons cache that Captain Keyes has been looking for, with a Marine detachment, but as you arrive, something's just not right. Everything's a little off, and while you dispatch a few Covenant, and as you begin to explore, you find that the Covenant aren't like they were before. They're not waiting to ambush you, they're not set up in defensive positions. When you look closely, you'll realise they're actually in retreat. The further into the structure you get, the fewer enemies you'll find, and the more you start to feel uneasy. Corridors are scarred with plasma burns and covered in Covenant blood. Rooms with stationary turrets and ammo stores have been set up, but not a soul in sight to use them. You find a crazed Marine who opens fire on you and screams, terrified and distraught. Part of the room's collapsed and on fire. Everywhere you go, there's evident sign of struggle, but no sign of what caused it or why. The feeling of uneasiness is only amplified by the fact that Cortana, who's been happily narrating and expositing for your entire game, was left behind in the last mission, and now you've got nobody to talk to you. Not only is this mission off-putting intense, you're also the most alone you've ever been at any point in the game. That is, until you find out what happened to Captain Keyes and his Marines. Then all of a sudden, you're very much not alone. The Flood are a parasitic life form who can consume the biomass of sufficiently large and sufficiently intelligent life, i.e., if you're big and smart enough, you're a prime bait for Flood assimilation. Once consumed, they control your biomass, reshape your body, organs, muscles, jump higher, further, punch harder, but also they can pick up weapons and use them at range. They're also highly intelligent and extremely virile. By which I mean they spread like a virus, it's nothing to do with semen, I'm just going to shut up. On my first playthrough, I was terrified on this level. Everything just made me feel so uneasy. The idea that the Covenant, who for the entire first act have had us on the back foot, were afraid and suddenly the ones dying. It was no longer just humanity versus the Covenant. This was a free-for-all. From that point on, your goal shifts from fighting the Covenant to fighting the Flood. Act 2 has an overarching goal of just activating Halo's defenses and containing the Flood with the help of Guilty Spark. This act is short and concluded after barely a mission and a half, but it's all the time we need to set up the Flood and how much of a threat they are. Now I know what you're thinking. The introduction of the Flood is exactly what I said earlier shouldn't work in a story like this, which is that instead of acting like a secondary antagonist, they usurp the role as the primary antagonist. And while the Covenant is still locked in combat with the Flood and steadily losing every skirmish, the Flood by contrast are becoming stronger with every encounter, able to grow in numbers as they spread across the ring. So the question is, how do they make this work? The secret to any good plot twist is laying the foundation of the twist without anybody noticing. If people notice you dropping hints that are too obvious, your audience begins to guess or focus on the information you give them, expecting a twist. And if you give them nothing, the twist comes out of nowhere and falls flat. So how did Halo manage to lay the groundwork for the Flood without us realizing? The answer, I believe, lies in the setting of the story, Halo itself. From the very beginning of the story, you don't know anything about this ring, you're just a trespasser on it because you needed a place to flee in a moment of panic. The Covenant hold a deep religious significance for it, but that's all you know about them, and you don't know enough about their culture. But it's clear from the design, the world you step on, the weather, the machinery, the unnatural cave structures, they've all been built, purposefully engineered by a civilization that is neither Covenant nor human. That mystery and that intrigue is with you from Mission 1, whether you realise it or not. While nobody in-game actually asks the questions out loud, we the player notice it and wonder. Each mission adds a new piece to the puzzle of what Halo is and why it's there. Its presence is constant. You can see it in every level as you look up at the span and see just how massive it is. It's never an objective. Nobody ever tells you to find out what Halo is. People just make passing remarks, or you find structures, elevators, tunnel networks. Each mission that takes place on Halo, its very presence surrounding you at every point, but very few people ask the question, why is it here? That question gets answered, and when it does, I feel like the reason for Halo just clicks into place, like all the puzzle pieces finally line up. Now that we know the Flood, we know why Halo was built. It was because of the Flood. Stop them spreading. It's all here for them. It's all here to stop them. The Flood mix up the gameplay by providing an enemy type that can cover huge distances, use melee attacks, wield the same Covenant weapons we've encountered so far in the game, as well as wield the human weapons, which gives a sort of sick irony as you start getting absolutely nailed by shotguns and magnums. The infection forms move in swarms and are harmless when your shields are up, but when you're without, they can absolutely devastate you. Carriers explode on impact and can be used to your advantage if you kill them from a distance, but can be absolutely horrific if they manage to sneak up on you. You really have to think about your weapon tactics. You want up-close power like a shotgun for when things get close quarters, but you also need something with stopping power at long range, like a magnum or a sniper rifle. But you also want something that has rapid fire for when the swarms are coming at you. And throw that into the mix, the Covenant is still trying their damnedest to fight you and flee from Halo, providing pockets of firefights with both enemies. You have to really switch your established tactic from Act 1 with a brand new playset. 2 Betrayals, Keys, The Maw provide some really fun, varied gameplay, even with the reused maps, and they also give a huge insight into the story of how dangerous the Flood can be. I had a hunch, so I replayed the final few missions to be sure, but after you leave your squadron of Marines at the end of 343 Guilty Spark in the swamp, you don't see another Marine unit for the entire game, with the exception of Forehammer, who appears in the Maw, but not as like a physical Marine, you know how that ends. 2 Betrayals begins its mission with a chapter called A Gun Pointed at the Head of the Universe, which is an accurate description for the third act in Halo. The metaphorical gun not just in terms of the Halo, but the Flood as well. Your mission has now become to stop Guilty Spark from firing the Halo and wiping out life in a large area, or stopping the Flood from escaping the ring and wiping out possibly all life in the galaxy. The Covenant aren't even a main objective anymore. And that makes sense. The Flood is such a threat that even the Covenant, who've been fighting you at every turn, are now just fighting the Flood in every encounter, trying their best to scuttle cruisers and escape the ring. The Monitor is desperate to contain the Flood and activate the ring, and even for you, wave after wave of disfigured UNSC-clad monsters come running at you down a corridor wielding human weapons. They're dangerous. You begin to get a sense of what must have happened so long ago in this story before you even set foot on Halo, why it was built in the first place, why such a desperate measure was needed. The Forerunners really didn't have another choice. The effort in the storytelling of Halo really shines through in this early game. You really get the feeling that the story began eons before you existed or even set foot on Halo, that it's something so ancient and mysterious. As you learn about its purpose in the game, you still get the feeling you only know half the story. And whatever the full story is, it's clear that it goes way beyond your squabble with the Covenant. The Flood introduce a threat not just to humanity but to the universe as we know it. And no matter what happens from here on in, no matter how big the picture gets, we're a part of that story now. And this is how I believe in November 2001, Bungie managed to pull off a narrative miracle, a storytelling device that introduces a plot twist villain mid-story, and it makes the game all the more impressive. Something that so many others still try to do and fail to do. Well, I guess there's nothing else to say really, except thank you for watching. Oh, and if you're wondering what was in the box at the start, it was this fresh new microphone. Very excited to have this. And the only thing that's left is to thank you for 20 years of Halo. See you guys later.